It's February 15th, 2017, and as of right now, Oroville Dam is still standing. Oroville Dam is the biggest dam you've probably never heard of. It wasn't the product of the New Deal or the build-up to World War II. Instead, Oroville Dam was built as one part of the state of California's massive infrastructure of storage, canals, and aqueducts to transport water from the high Sierras to the Central Valley and Southern California cities. It's an earth-filled dam of massive proportions. 770 feet tall, this dam holds back over 3.5 million acre-feet of water. For the past few years, this, along with other California reservoirs, has been the poster image for drought in the American West. How low the lake levels go is purely a function of how much water came in during the spring thaw and how much water was used up in the summer. And just like spending more money than you make results in an empty bank account, one of the results of a drought are low water levels in the reservoirs. I feel like it's important to point out that the dams didn't cause the droughts. They're simply a nice visual image of the results. What many people fail to grasp is that the dams are the only thing keeping us from really feeling the effects of not enough water. Instead, we use the water in the lakes like emergency funds to get us by while we figure out a long-term plan, like better conservation and sustainable use. But enough about that. Back to Oroville Dam. The Feather River is one of those rivers that has way too much water in the spring runoff season and not enough water in the rest of the year. Oroville Dam was built to store that water and to provide hydropower year-round. In 2014, Lake Oroville looked like this, and people were saying things like this. It took almost 10 years for California's reservoirs to get to these historic lows, and many people suspected it would take just as long to fill them back up, or that they may never again be flush with surplus water. But they were wrong. It took only 1 year to end the drought, and suddenly the reservoirs are full. Which brings us to the events of spring 2017. Trouble first appeared on Tuesday, February 7th, when a maintenance worker noticed water in the spillway behaving in a way that didn't seem right. The water in the spillway was immediately turned off and revealed a 100-foot-long crater in the concrete. Now, how this hole started is anyone's guess, but it's reasonable to think that it began as a simple pothole that grew and grew and grew under the ongoing force of the water. This would be bad news under any circumstances, but it was especially bad because it happened in February and the lake was still rising. The decision was made to reopen the spillway, but at a reduced flow to minimize further damage to the concrete, which didn't exactly work. The water continued to rip the spillway channel apart, eventually carving a new channel to the side and removing hundreds of tons of rock and soil from the hillside. But the dam managers had what they thought was a fail-safe backup. The so-called emergency spillway, immediately to the side of the main spillway, would guide any extra water from the reservoir around the dam and ensure there was no danger of the dam itself overtopping. Now here's where I have to throw my first of many challenge flags on this whole thing. The emergency spillway is not a spillway at all. It's simply a low spot on the adjoining hillside that happened to be engineered to be at a lower elevation than the crest of the dam. The lake will naturally overtop here before it overtops the dam, giving a certain degree of safety without actually considering the consequences of what's about to happen. This is not a real spillway. It's just a hillside with rock and dirt and trees and roads and a few high voltage power lines in the way. It's extremely obvious that this was never intended to be used, which makes it all the more insane that the California Department of Water Resources announced in a press conference that they intended to activate the emergency spillway. Activate? There's no gates on this thing. You don't activate this spillway, it just happens when you've lost all control of the elevation of the water levels. Sure enough, water began pouring down the hillside at 8:30 a.m. on February 11th and gradually began scouring trees, soil, and rocks down the hillside. All appeared to be fine until suddenly an evacuation order was issued for 180,000 residents that same day to get out of the path of the Feather River. So what changed? After just a few short hours, the hillside had eroded back enough to threaten the small weir dam at the top of the hill. It may not be the large dam itself, but losing this small structure would take the uncontrolled flow over the hillside from a little and make it a lot, scouring out even more hillside and risking a chain reaction of erosion. Put another way, the Feather River is now trying to carve a new path around Oroville Dam, and the emergency spillway is the path of least resistance. Suddenly, all priorities changed. The damaged spillway was opened to full throttle in an attempt to lower the lake and pinch off the flow over the hillside. The spillway erosion eventually reached equilibrium with the bedrock, and things began to stabilize. As long as the damaged spillway areas don't erode any further, the main dam should be safe. Right now it's mid-February and we are not even close to the end of this story. The erosion caused by the broken spillway has deposited enormous amounts of rock and debris in the river, raising the level of the channel and backing water up towards the base of the dam, slowing down the amount of water able to be released through the power plant, which only means more water having to be sent over the damaged spillway. There are several ways the story could play out, and since February 7th, I've been pretty good at calling the plays before they happen. So here goes my predictions on what's going to happen next. Scenario 1. Spring runoff is manageable and the spillway holds. Spring rains bring more runoff into the lake, and the California Department of Water Resources is able to keep up by running water through the damaged spillway for the next 6 to 8 weeks. The spillway sustains more damage, but nothing that threatens the structure of the dam or its foundations. My guess is that sometime in June, work will begin to rebuild the spillway from scratch and reinforce the hillside spill channel. Final price tag? Somewhere between $500 to $750 million. Scenario 2. Spring runoff is historically high and the spillway fails. Remember, if the amount of water coming into the lake exceeds the amount of water that can be passed through the dam, the lake rises higher and higher. If it rises higher than 901 feet above sea level, it's going over that hillside whether we want it to or not. And if that happens, it could all be over in a matter of hours. Not the whole dam, mind you. The dam is still relatively safe. But the river wants to make a new channel. And if it was able to carve out all this with only 12 inches going over the top for 12 hours, just imagine what days or weeks could do. And with every inch eroded off the top, the flow just gets deeper and faster. At this point, the Feather River is already well above flood stage from all the water being passed frantically around the dam. Then suddenly, a second wave of uncontrolled water passes over the hillside and joins the flood below. When it's all said and done, Lake Oroville is 50 to 150 feet lower because of the new notch cut through the hillside, and the people of California are faced with the question of building a new wing dam to restore Oroville to its original capacity, or to decommission the structure entirely. Final price tag? Too many zeros to even guess. As of February 17th, my money is on scenario 1. I think the dam will hold, and the spillway will be able to handle spring runoffs. But there are two very important lessons to take away from this. One is that the current disaster was caused 100% by human error. There was no reason for the lake to be allowed to top out in early February instead of the usual target date in June. The snow readings in the mountains were always there for anyone to read, and the call should have been made to make room for a bigger than normal runoff season. Also, somewhere out there, there's an inspection crew that didn't look closely enough at the spillway. The dam is 48 years old. It was somebody's job to make sure there weren't voids under the concrete slab ready to turn into sinkholes. That person didn't do their job. And another thing, the notion of using the emergency spillway shows just how uninformed the California Department of Water Resources was about their own facilities. Anyone who has walked near the so-called emergency spillway, and I have by the way, can see that the geology is not prepared for an uncontrolled flow of water. The soil is soft, the rocks are fractured, and everything is ripe for sliding downhill. See that washed out road? It used to connect to a boat launch ramp and a picnic area. None of the people who ever built the dam thought this thing should actually be used. Why on earth would DWR allow it now? The second lesson that needs to be learned is just because rivers or watersheds have acted a certain way doesn't mean that they always will. There are dry years and there are wet years. There are drought years and there are flood years. And then every once in a while, there are years with so much water that human minds have a hard time comprehending it, much less planning for it. This is a picture of an early survey crew working in Black Canyon on the Colorado River on what is now Hoover Dam. Look up on the canyon wall. See that discolored mark about 30 feet up? That's the normal flood stage on the Colorado River. That is how much the river would swell under typical runoff conditions. But look at the top of the photo. See that high bathtub mark about 80 feet above the workers? That's from a flood that we know happened but have no record of, because it was before anyone was taking official measurements of the river. We don't even know if any Western eyes saw this particular flood. We only know that it happened sometime in the last few hundred years. Maybe only once, but it happened, which means it could happen again. Never forget that the reservoir that is empty today could be full tomorrow. And if you didn't make room for a 100-year flood to come into your reservoir, don't act surprised when the river tries to create a new path on its own. Thanks for watching.
Because even though that giant hole has opened up in that spillway, they actually have to run water down that spillway right now. They can't stop. because Lake Oroville, up at the top, it's full.
If you're interested in hearing more about how earth-filled dams react to water going through them, check out my Teton Dam video by clicking here. And if you want to read a fun bit of fiction with a weirdly prophetic streak, check out Robert Burns' The Dam, a story about a dam and a heroic engineer who tries to warn people about its collapse. It is totally unrelated to this current topic, except that the author once worked on Oroville Dam and admitted that he borrowed some details about its layout and design. Check it out.